Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. One of the most interesting aspects of the predictable butthurt so many people have about the orange man and his shenanigans is that it's not different than it's ever been. Is he emboldening the racists? Sure he is, but no more than Biden did when he illegally funneled money to the police without requiring them to do anything for it, or Obama did when he blatantly refused to punish these race soldiers when they were killing black people, and when he called young black people thugs because they were resisting police violence. See, these are the things that embolden the white supremacists too. All Trump is doing is being honest about his intentions and how he's going to go about doing it. That's the problem that they have. See, I can handle an honest enemy. What I won't tolerate is a false friend. See, what they don't like is the fact that all of the open, blatant racism that Trump is carrying out could be the beginning of a discussion about what's going to be done to roll all this stuff back, to push back against it. And if you look at the Democrats' behavior, at least for the last 60 or so years, you see they haven't done anything. That's what they're really concerned about. All this racism and bigotry that they've let go on long before the orange man was in the White House. And now they're thinking to themselves, man, is this going to be the beginning of pushing back the public being led by the black community, saying you're going to have to put some real agendas on the table against this? See, that's what came out of the 2020 uprisings. The big issue that year was punishing the police. Biden paid lip service to it by saying that there would be a White House-level police accountability commission and a George Floyd Policing Act, neither of which he made good on. And then you had nigga Jim Clyburn, America's favorite sharecropper, whining and complaining that the very young people who put the Democrats back in power should be shut up from saying defund the police. After 2020, we started seeing the police finally being regularly charged and put on trial for their crimes. That wasn't because of the Democrats. The Democrats didn't pass one bill or even speak about a law regarding qualified immunity. They did absolutely nothing. It was the people in the streets who changed the social climate and made sure the prosecutors understood they're being watched now. That's what brought about a change as far as how the police can no longer expect to automatically be allowed to get away with murder. Not because of the Democrats, but because of the people in the streets. And that's what we're seeing going on right now. The Democrats have never been the ones who have been dragging America forward for the little inch or two that it might be perceived to move forward. A huge part of America's so-called soft power is this phony veneer, this fake propaganda front that America's some sort of country that needs to be emulated because it's so forward-moving and progressive. That's the reason why I consider Trump being back in office to be a great thing, because it verifies to the world that his first term wasn't some anomaly. It wasn't some wild one-off that would never recur. This is what America is. And a number of people are now forced to have to ask, is this what America has always been? Has it always been a lie? That would not have happened if you had Kamala Harris as president. Why does the world see the U.S. as being progressive, forward-thinking, or even civilized? It is completely and thoroughly because of us. Whenever people talk about the things that are good about the United States, or decent or civilized, all of it, 100% of it comes back to us. It wasn't Irish immigrants, it wasn't Chinese immigrants, it wasn't Latino immigrants, it wasn't the people with the white European values. White European values is what gave the world chattel slavery. White European values is what gave the world segregation, the black codes, Jim Crow, the chain gangs, mass incarceration, the destruction of entire enclaves based solely on race. That's what white European values gave the world. Black values gave the world the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Black values are what brought about freedom riders and social change. Black values are what said that decency and justice is supposed to be what the society is based on. And every day that we have been fighting to bring that about, we've had the dominant society fighting tooth and nail against it. This nation was founded on barbarism and still carries it out today. But the lie put forward by the white media is that the struggle that we waged and the changes we brought about was somehow also agreed upon by the dominant society. Why, look at Honest Abe. Forget about the fact that he was a rampant racist. He said that he did not believe in the equality of the races, that he would see the superior position assigned to the white man. He repeatedly said that if he could have held the Union together without freeing even one black person, that's what he would have done. He himself said the only reason that he called for the end of slavery was because he didn't have any other choice. But that's not the way that he's portrayed in all the movies. Spielberg didn't portray him that way in that Abraham Lincoln movie, and neither do any of these so-called documentarians. And the same thing goes for FDR. This guy was not some champion of civil rights. He was a stonewall against it. And the same thing for President Kennedy, and the same thing for LBJ. Oh yeah, they'll sit there and show him saying his one little speech, "We shall overcome." But they don't show anything about the fact that this man was just a good old boy from Texas who was no different than any other garden variety bigot from his home state. That's the reality. But that's not what the white media puts out there. And because the white media saturates the world, they were able to basically show this lie that because black people waged our struggle inside the United States, why, the rest of American society was more or less on board with it, when the truth of the matter was we had to drag them kicking and screaming, and they've been fighting ever since to go backwards. They always put us out front, and then they claim that we're the proof that America has changed. Too many times, black people are only too jolly in the behind to allow themselves and even their children to be used as nothing more than PR props for the dominant society. And this is what fuels the phony narrative of American progress that the rest of the world is swallowed because America's lie reflects their own. What they're doing is like that fat chick. You know the one. In every group of females, there's always that one chick who's way fatter than the others. Even among overweight women, there's usually one who's just morbidly obese. They're always trying to hang out with their slimmer, fitter friends, though. See, the fat chick figures that by standing next to them it makes her look slimmer, when in reality she sticks out like a sore thumb. That is, unless she can get some of her fit friends to vouch for her. That's why they have a few front Negroes who get out there and talk that stupid we stuff. Family, don't ever let that be you, and don't let that be your kids either. Part of the reason we find ourselves having to fight for our survival is because we've allowed white media propaganda and their bootlicks to get us to be quiet about how we've been treated, and then in worst cases we got empty-headed Negroes who get out there denying it. That's why it was so damnable when in 2004 Barack Obama was talking that gibberish at the DNC convention about there is no black America, there is no white America, only the United States of America. Now, whenever you hear a melanated, or in his case, half-melanated person vomiting out garbage like that, that's a Negro who's looking to appeal to a white audience. Because the central lie about America is that this country has always been making progress. That's the quintessential American lie, but it's one that's been told so often for so long, people have bought into it. In America, everything is always better now than it was before. Isn't that the lie? They tell you that because Barack Obama became president, things are better now than they were, say, in the 1980s. And in the 80s, they said things were better than they were in the 60s with the fire hoses and the police dogs and the assassinations of black leaders. In the 60s, though, they said that things were better than they were in the 20s and 30s with the lynchings. In the 20s and 30s, they said things were better than they were at the turn of the century with the white mobs who wiped out entire black towns and the race riots. At the turn of the century, they said things were better than they were during slavery, and during slavery, they said black people were better off than we were in Africa. So no matter what time period you're talking about in America, they always push the lie that, well, things are better now than they were just a few years ago. And you tell people that lie when they're young, when they don't know any better. People tend to mythologize and sanitize their youth. No matter how bad their upbringing was, in their own minds, they tend to turn it into a golden time in their lives. This is why you get morons like Candace Owens saying stuff like, "When I was growing up in the 90s, race wasn't a problem at all." First of all, she's an immigrant, and you find a lot of immigrants who are only too happy to be able to repeat that, well, racism isn't really a problem stuff, even when they didn't grow up here in the United States. Yeah, they know what the dominant society wants to hear, and they say that crap right up until white supremacy kicks them in the butt. Then all of a sudden, they suddenly realize racism does exist. Candace Owens was born in 1989. She was barely in 6th grade by the end of the 90s. The year she was born, Trump was taking out ads in the New York Times demanding the death penalty for innocent black teenagers. In 1991, when she was 2 years old, Rodney King was savagely beaten. The very next year, when she was 3 years old, the LA race riots occurred when the thugs who assaulted Rodney King were acquitted. In 1994, Bill Clinton passed Joe Biden's crime bill. And speaking of 94, O.J. Simpson was charged with murder, and the white media made a 3-ring racial circus out of that. Even after he was acquitted in 1995, Jeffrey Toobin coined the phrase the race card for that, and the white media demonized Johnny Cochran instead of looking at the racist cop Mark Furman, who had perjured himself multiple times on the stand. 1996, you had the St. Petersburg, Florida riot, which occurred, well, for the same reason as most of America's riots, because the police murdered an unarmed black man. And Ed Blum began his asinine jihad against black students in colleges and universities in the 90s as well. There were plenty of other racial incidents, too, during the 90s, such as the Million Man March, bans on rap albums, Michael Jackson being defamed through frivolous lawsuits, you have it. The 90s was absolutely saturated in all sorts of racial controversy and strife. And yet you got Candace Owens and others on the white right who are pushing this garbage that apparently the 90s was some colorblind, halcyon period of peace and prosperity in America where race didn't even matter. Everyone was colorblind now. These are people who mostly push white media fantasies. They talk about TV shows, but only the ones that don't deal with racial themes. There were plenty of TV programs, either episodically or the entire show, that dealt with race in the 90s. But that falls down the memory hole because it doesn't fit Candace Owens and the white right's narrative. You see, it's okay for her to go ahead and lie about her childhood because it doesn't cost her anything. She depends on the white right for every crumb of her daily bread. But it would be lethal if you as a black person tried to repeat her lies and live by it, because white supremacy won't play along with that delusion. Now understand something. Both the Democrats and the Republicans do this. That's why I have an image of the little boy that Trump had at his speech to that joint session of Congress. Everyone knows how racist America is towards black people and how blatant the Republicans are about it. So to have Trump focusing on a black person, well, that's meant to bestow goodness on himself. And this isn't even the first time Republicans have done a stunt like this. W invited the so-called subway Superman to his State of the Union address. This was a man, you'll recall, who was in the news because he had saved the life of a white man who had passed out and fallen onto the subway tracks in New York City. And this was during a time when W was getting dragged, at least by the Democrats, for how poorly his little wars were going. This was his way of getting himself some positive press, and the worst part was, it worked. And by the way, this guy had a number of meetings with a number of high-profile white people who couldn't wait to get cameras there for themselves, including Donald Trump, who said that he was going to be giving money to this man's family, ostensibly for his daughter, I suppose. No word on whether Trump actually came through on that promise. But nobody was mentioning then that, hey, isn't this the same Donald Trump who wanted the Central Park Five to be put to death? Isn't this the same Donald Trump who was discriminating against black people living in his apartments back in the 70s? No mention of that. Oh, they were treating him as the guy who was on The Apprentice. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody in the white media, dared to bring up what a total contradiction it was for Donald Trump, of all people, to be calling himself making nice with a black person when his own record of anti-black racism was putrid, open, and undeniable. But the white media certainly seemed to forget. So it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, a Republican, or, at that time, a self-interested real estate fraud from New York. As long as you're using a black person as one of your crash dummies for a PR stunt, it's all good. The dominant society is supposed to use black people for that, to give themselves basically a morality laundering. Now, had that black man saved the life of another black person, do you seriously think the white media would have made such a cause celeb out of him at all? He was featured on all the networks and a number of talk shows as well. But do you actually think that he would have been invited to the White House if it had been a black person that he saved? This is part of how the white media programs black people. Sure, they'll call you a hero, but just as long as you're saving someone who isn't black. Both parties play this game. The Republicans are clumsy about it because their own attempts at being racially accepting flies in the face of their own nonstop anti-black racism. But you need to recognize that Democrats do the same thing, only they have more Negroes on the payroll, and the white media is somewhat less critical about it. Coming out of the Bush years and the beginnings of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was all kinds of talk about how divisive the Republicans are. And while these points were valid, the problem is, rather than this leading to Democrats taking a hard line on pushing back and rolling back all the regressive moves that the white right had made during the Bush years, instead of admitting to the racial reality, instead, we got the cynical fraud of Barack Obama and the so-called post-racial America. They were trying to bury all of these wrongs that had happened, not rectify them. On a side note, you'll recall it was Henry Gates who coined that phrase, post-racial America. He thought that because his fellow Ivy League bootlick Obama was in the White House, that this would be great for boule like himself. Remember, as I've always told you, when you see these black celebrities and politicians talking about black, they're not referring to you and me. They're not referring to black people as a collective. They're talking exclusively about themselves, because their idea of black goes no further than themselves, and it's literally only skin deep. So when Skip Gates and his ilk talk about post-racial America, they're talking about themselves and their own position in this country. Well, as with everything else, Skip Gates was dead wrong, because no sooner than he uttered the phrase post-racial America, the real America came into his home and dragged him out in handcuffs. See, this bootlicking boule butt kisser may be willing to pretend that white supremacy doesn't exist, but the white supremacists didn't play along. America is always putting out the lie that the nation has turned the corner, when in reality all this changed is the news cycle. The Democrats' goal is to make sure that the black grassroots do not box them in and corner them to the point that they have to make some sort of pledge to an agenda to push back against all of this rampant white nationalist nonsense that's been going on. Their goal is to maintain the status quo, and that means they don't do anything that's going to be empowering black people. I need everyone to understand that this is where the so-called 2026 midterms are going. I want you to be ready in case the Democrats called themselves doing what they've done in the past, like they did after the Bush years, and they start flooding the zone with all kinds of America is better than this rhetoric, and we're all one happy colorblind family before the orange man came along. They'll be sitting here basically doing a remake of Obama's There Is No Black America or White America crap. Because when they say that, what they're also saying is there's no need for us to actually do anything to rectify the harms done to black people because there is no black America or white America, there's just America. What's called for here is to admit to the racial reality, to call white supremacy what it is, identify anti-black racism as the primary social disease in America that must be rooted out, and to specify the foundational black Americans in specific are its victims, and to put together slates, plural, of policies and the power of the state to crush this evil. To not merely roll back the white supremacist policies put forward by Trump himself, but also to crush these white supremacist operatives who have been running around, people like Chris Rufo, Ed Blum, and others, these white supremacist think tanks who have been allowed to use dark white money in order to push all of this anti-black agenda. Put an end to allowing groups like the Federalist Society to infiltrate their members into government. Now, this is not what the Democrats want. They've had 30 years to go after these guys, and instead they joined with the enemy. Look what they're saying and doing today. As we get closer to next year's midterms, Democrats are not going to declare war on white supremacy. Instead, they're going to start in with the happy talk, and they'll start sounding more like Candace Owens' delusional fever dream about the 90s than the hard realities of Project 2025. The same way Democrats and people like Joe Scarborough instantly switched from saying Trump is the next Hitler to instead saying we got to find ways to work with him, and instead of holding protests, they're holding up paddles. We can't let them set the tone or let them hit the reset button. And we can't let any Negroes get out there and be the face of any pathetic attempt to whitewash or clean up the U.S.'s image, because that's the super objective that they're going for here. Ultimately, what they're trying to do is they're trying to do a reset, which is going to basically involve, let's pretend as if the orange man didn't come along and all that white supremacist stuff, but we're going to leave in place whatever he did. Now that we won't be changing. The same way that the Democrats made no moves whatsoever during Hillary Clinton's campaign to talk about all of the anti-black policies that her husband Bill put on the books. And during Joe Biden's campaigns, not only would he refuse to even so much as apologize for what he had done, he denied all of it, and he had his little mouthpiece, Simone Manny Sanders, doing the same. So as Democrats see it, they're not going to let themselves get cornered on the idea that they're going to be required to push back against all these policies when upholding the policies and maintaining them is what they want. And we're not going to allow the next Barack Obama, whomever that may be, to come along and try to convince the world that America has turned the page. And this also goes for the big budget propaganda pieces that the white media puts on the movie screens and television screens, where they have someone, often people from foreign countries, who will portray a foundational black American, and it's always going to be more of the, well, don't we all just get along stuff? No more of these images being put out there without us calling them out. We're not going to let them sit here and try to whitewash their image anymore. Too many black people have basically cast themselves in the role of redeeming the dominant society. That's what a lot of black folks think that they're doing. They think it's their job to redeem these evil white supremacists. And it's not. It is not our job to help them because they refuse to help themselves. We didn't make these white supremacists evil, so it's neither our obligation nor our responsibility to make them decent. It is way past time that black people stop participating in this pathetic charade of trying to portray the dominant society as something other than what they are. No more using black people as some sort of morality car wash. Until this dirty nation does right by us, let them wallow in their own filth. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Seven Tahuti, Stephen Mayfield, Atu Hammond, Turk McKenzie, and LB. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.